History as it happens, April 13th, 2023. Decade of drift?
A day when Mikhail Gorbachev resigned as the president of a Soviet Union which had already ceased to exist.
Tricolor banner of the Russian Republic now flies over the Kremlin.
New power broker, Russian President Boris Yeltsin.
Eastern Europe is free. The Soviet Union itself is no more.
There will be new challenges for NATO.
Iraq must withdraw from Kuwait completely, immediately, and without condition.
One of 6 U.S. soldiers listed as missing in the heaviest fighting yet in Mogadishu. 12 American soldiers killed.
Why are we still there? What are we trying to accomplish? How did a humanitarian mission turn violent?
Saddam Hussein is a congenital liar, and he cheats and he steals.
I want to announce that the military leaders of Haiti have agreed to step down from power. The warring factions in Bosnia reached a peace agreement. As a result of our efforts in Dayton,
we will continue to protect our national interests around the world, in the Middle East, and elsewhere. No one should doubt our resolve to remain a force for peace and for stability.
Car bombs exploded outside the U.S. embassies in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam.
To strike at the network of radical groups affiliated with and funded by Osama bin Laden, perhaps the preeminent...
NATO can do for Europe's East what it did for Europe's West.
In Russia today, the clear winner of the Russian presidential election, Vladimir Putin, began to establish the Putin era.
The United States emerged from the Cold War at the apex of global power, with no obvious enemies, as democracy and capitalism spread to lands once dominated by Moscow. This new world was not peaceful, and the U.S. would find itself drifting or bouncing from one crisis to the next, seeking to define its role as global policeman, to find a purpose for its unmatched power, to shape a world order where market economies and free societies could put down roots. It all looks so promising, at least for a bit. That's next as we report History as it Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
We cannot, indeed we should not, do everything or be everywhere. But where our values and our interests are at stake and where we can make a difference, we must be prepared to do so.
In the summer of 1995, Bosnian Serb soldiers massacred 8,000 civilians in Srebrenica in a savage act of ethnic cleansing in the Balkans. In response, in late August, NATO warplanes launched the largest military action in the alliance's history, 2 weeks of airstrikes to back a Croat Muslim ground offensive. By November, the warring side sat down in Dayton, Ohio, and agreed to make peace.
Tonight, I want to speak with you about implementing the Bosnian peace agreement and why our values and interests as Americans require that we participate. Let me say at the outset, America's role will not be about fighting a war.
To defend his decision to intervene in a civil war whose outcome, it would appear, might have little, if any, direct effect on the United States, in a place most Americans knew very little about, President Bill Clinton invoked something more important than simple state interests, such as security or maintaining open markets. He held up the nation's historic mission, its ideals, and apparent responsibilities. This is an extended clip, about 2 minutes, but it is worth listening to every word.
From our birth, America has always been more than just a place. America has embodied an idea that has become the ideal for billions of people throughout the world. Our founders said it best. America is about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In this century especially, America has done more than simply stand for these ideals. We have acted on them and sacrificed for them. Our people fought 2 world wars so that freedom could triumph over tyranny. After World War I, we pulled back from the world, leaving a vacuum that was filled by the forces of hatred. After World War II, we continued to lead the world. We made the commitments that kept the peace, that helped to spread democracy, that created unparalleled prosperity, and that brought victory in the Cold War. Today, because of our dedication, America's ideals, liberty, democracy, and peace, are more and more the aspirations of people everywhere in the world. It is the power of our ideas, even more than our size, our wealth, and our military might, that makes America a uniquely trusted nation. With the Cold War over, some people now question the need for our continued active leadership in the world. They believe that, much like after World War I, America can now step back from the responsibilities of leadership. They argue that to be secure, we need only to keep our own borders safe, and that the time has come now to leave to others the hard work of leadership beyond our borders. I strongly disagree.
Now, by this point in the decade, the USSR had been gone for several years already. U.S. leaders believed they had kicked the Vietnam syndrome once and for all and mastered war by kicking Saddam Hussein's armies out of Kuwait with relative ease. But the New World Order proved messy and hard for the world's sole superpower to manage. In 1993, 18 U.S. soldiers were killed in a gun battle in Mogadishu, Somalia, depicted with great dramatic effect in the movie Black Hawk Down. And soon all U.S. forces would be withdrawn from that country. In 1994, the U.S. sent troops into Haiti to save President Aristide, but chose not to intervene in the Rwandan genocide, a decision that is said to have haunted Clinton as he pondered what to do in Bosnia. The U.S. would return to the Balkans in 1999, once more under the banner of NATO and for humanitarian reasons. The year prior, in 98, Clinton ordered airstrikes against Iraq after Saddam kicked out weapons inspectors. His Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, delivered remarks that sounded like she could have gotten a job a few years later in the George W. Bush administration.
For months, we have said that every option was on the table. Unfortunately, one by one, the diplomatic options have been rebuffed. Iraq has a simple choice: reverse course or face the consequences.
So when I published a series of episodes about the 20th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq last month, I thought, we tend to look back on past decades as discrete, 10-year-long strips of history. The 90s seem to fit this view. A decade squeezed between two long periods of conflict, the Cold War and the global war on terrorism. A decade where the U.S. searched for a new purpose for its power, now that Soviet communism was gone and Islamic jihadism had yet to subsume all else. But this perspective obscures continuities in the ideology of U.S. foreign policy and in the problems confronting the nation. Just take Iraq as one example. Same problem, but viewed in a new, more threatening light after 9/11 happened. Take al-Qaeda, a name Americans started becoming familiar with in 1998.
There is convincing information from our intelligence community that the bin Laden terrorist network was responsible for these bombings. Based on this information, we have high confidence that these bombings were planned, financed, and carried out by the organization bin Laden leads.
I'll just mention that in response to the embassy bombings in Africa, the U.S. bombed a medicine factory in Sudan. During the Clinton-Yeltsin years, international terrorism was one in an array of global challenges juggled by the United States. It did not receive as much sustained attention as, say, relations with Russia, as the U.S. stepped on the gas for NATO enlargement, as Russia's attempts at establishing a market economy led to disastrous results.
But I don't believe anyone could ever have doubted that there would be obstacles on Russia's road to a vibrant economy and a strong democracy.
The decade ended with Yeltsin handpicking some guy named Vladimir, who is still in power in the Kremlin, who is now on his 5th U.S. president. The dream of a new European security system, including Russia, would remain just that, a dream. So it is important to revisit the assumptions or hopes embraced by U.S. leaders, public intellectuals, historians, and others as the 1990s unfolded. Assumptions about the spread of democracy, the primacy of markets over ideology, and confidence in U.S. military power, really air power, as a diplomatic tool. Maybe it wasn't a decade of drift, but rather a decade where the U.S. tried to establish global hegemony based on those timeless ideals Clinton invoked in his 1995 speech. New world, same U.S. The Warsaw Pact might be gone, but NATO would stay. All while welcoming China into the global marketplace, the rules-based trading system, because that would lead to domestic reform, maybe even democracy in Mao's homeland.
Bringing China into the WTO is a win-win decision. It will protect our prosperity, and it will promote the right kind of change in China. It is good for our farmers, for our manufacturers, and for our investors. Encouraging China to play by international rules, I say again, is an important step toward a safer, saner world.
Michael Kimmage specializes in the history of the Cold War and 20th century diplomatic and intellectual history, and in U.S. Russian relations from 1991 at Catholic University right here in D.C. From 2014 to 16, he served on the Secretary's policy planning staff at the State Department, where he held the Russia-Ukraine portfolio, and he is a regular on the podcast. Historian Michael Kimmage, welcome back.
Great to be back with you, Martin.
I thought it made sense to bring you back here because we've discussed aspects of the 1990s in previous episodes. I've talked about it with other historians as well. It's been impossible to avoid when talking about U.S. Russia relations in the context of the war in Ukraine. But it's important not to look at that decade, and I want your general thoughts on this before I start drilling down. It's important not to look at that decade as a peaceful decade that is squeezed between two periods of conflict. The Cold War, then the global war on terrorism. Because we can look back on history from present day through that perspective, but that's not how history is lived, right?
That, of course, is very true. And in even the kind of simplest sense of what a peaceful decade would be about, and frankly, there aren't too many peaceful decades in sort of human history across the board. But, the 1990s begins with the first Gulf War, which was short and ended pretty much on American terms, but it's very much a war. As your question indicates, it's one to which it's a region and a country to which the United States would return 10, 11 years later. So there's a linkage there between what's happening in the 90s and what comes after. And then, of course, there are the various wars in former Yugoslavia, which very much mark the decade. In terms of developments that are not entirely peaceful, you have the rise of China in the 1990s, which was not looked upon with the same trepidation that policymakers look upon China today.
It was welcomed by much of the world.
It was, and the phrase that was developed for China was responsible stakeholder, to sort of make it a part of the system. And in economic terms, it very much became a part of the system. But I think as we've learned, that China has its own ambitions, which are not identical by any means to those of Europe and the United States. And something similar could be said for Russia in the 1990s, which of course is kind of down and out and suffering from the transition from the Soviet Union to the post-Soviet world, but is also developing ambitions that really have, in some ways, very little to do with the ambitions of Western Europe and the ambitions of the United States in the 1990s. So on the one hand, you have a series of active conflicts, and of course we could widen our lens and look at Africa and Latin America and identify many more conflicts. And on the other hand, you have a series of developments that are not war per se, that are leading toward a world of multiple powers and multiple conflicting powers, and that happens to be the world that we live in today. So it's very important to revisit the 90s to understand the roots of that. It's not to say that today's conflicts are inevitable, but the roots do certainly lie in the 1990s.
There were two wars in Chechnya.
True.
Russia waged pretty viciously. The post-Cold War era also had plenty of continuities from the Cold War to the 1990s as far as tensions go and conflicts.
In terms of continuities, the most important continuity is the one that sometimes gets swept under the carpet when people speak of 1989 and 1991 as so transformative. The one most important continuity is China does not cease being communist China, either in 1989 or in 1991. And communist China is built on a very adversarial set of precepts and principles when it comes to the West and when it comes to the United States. Sort of by no means are all of those precepts and principles retired or put to rest in the early 1990s. If anything, China is developing far more capacity and far more ability to pursue its interests in its terms in the 1990s, and that's maybe the most important continuity of all. But the second continuity that's very significant is that Russia does not lose its historic concerns with Central and Eastern Europe. Even though the political form changes, it's no longer the Soviet Union, the sort of traditional set of interests, ambitions, attitudes, perspectives that Russia has had going back to the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries toward Eastern and Central Europe do not disappear. And that is very much a continuity, a kind of buffer zone, a set of privileged interests, near abroad, however you might term that. The United States might have felt that that was gone after 1991, sort of gone with the wind, but it wasn't. And those continuities are really important.
But U.S. leaders, public intellectuals, historians did believe we were on the precipice of a new era of human interaction, however you might put it. There were some assumptions that were made, or maybe even conclusions drawn by Francis Fukuyama about the best way to organize human societies. The Marxist model had been discredited. Democratic capitalism was on the march and triumphant.
The Soviet Union itself is no more. This is a victory for democracy and freedom. It's a victory for the moral force of our values. Every American can take pride in this victory, from the millions of men and women who've served our country in uniform to millions of Americans who supported their country in a strong defense under 9 presidents.
Yeah, I think you can point to a couple of dominant assumptions, and I think Fukuyama probably illustrates them most. As you're suggesting, it was not just a couple of voices, it was really a kind of consensus in the 1990s. And I think the first was the effectiveness of democracy, the success of democracy, the appeal of democracy. And, that was not without foundation. It is true that East Germans, preferred in the end to live in a West German style democracy than to live in communist East Germany, and that's in microcosm a change that was happening in a lot of places from the 70s through to the 90s. So that's an important and valid theme, but of course it was a lot less sweeping and widespread than people thought at the time. But we can get into the mistakes of these assumptions in a moment. Let's just stick with the assumptions. I think the second is that military affairs were no longer in the lead. It was the period of economic affairs. And if the early Cold War was one where there was a lot of anxiety about nuclear weapons, and it was sort of the nuclear age, and that's how you made a career, and that's how foreign affairs was defined. In the 1990s, a lot of people were drawn to, the movement of people, goods, capital, ideas across borders, what came to be known as globalization in the 1990s. And, globalization is a very old dynamic, but what's striking about the 1990s is how optimistic many people were about globalization, that it would sort of feed into greater democratization and bring the world closer together. And then thirdly, sort of academic jargon, but it's sort of come to be known as democratic peace theory. Greater global openness and greater democracy was going to make the world a more peaceful place. And what was often put forward as a principle and idea, and there are lots of people who would say this at the present moment, is that democracies don't go to war with each other. This is sort of true historically. So if you can build a world of integrated democracies, what you're going to have by definition is a state of peace. And that's definitely one of the hopes that Fukuyama is entertaining in the 1990s with this idea of the end of history. I mean, Fukuyama is worried about the end of history being kind of depressing. That's his concern, but he assumes that it's going to be peaceful. And so those are sort of the 3 core assumptions: more democracy, more trade and commerce, more globalization, and as a result, more peace.
We've been talking about continuities here, but the world did change. The communist bloc was gone, and therefore containment no longer made any sense. What were you going to roll back? I mean, some have said that the United States switched from a policy of containment or enhanced its policy of containment during the Cold War to begin to roll back communism in the Third World. But whatever the case was, there was no more Soviet Union anymore. So the Bush administration, H.W. Bush, they're in power for the first 3 years of this decade. Did the Bush administration struggle to come up with a new way or a new strategy to approach world affairs with, of course, the United States being on top as the lone superpower?
I think that was not really their struggle. Maybe if H.W. Bush had won a second term, that would have been the struggle. I think that what absolutely preoccupied them from 1988 to 1992 was the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I think in their assessment, and I happen to share this assessment, they did a pretty good job with that. There were lots of risks and dangers. They were concerned about civil unrest and strife in the former Soviet world. They were concerned about nuclear proliferation. They were just concerned that the Soviet Union would sort of go off the rails rather than politely disappearing, as it happened to do in 1991. And, Western Europe was a lot to navigate as well, where you did have residual concern in Britain and France about German reunification and what the future of Europe would be. And I think that the Bush senior administration just felt like this was a momentous moment, and it certainly was. It required a lot of deftness from American diplomacy, and that's what they tried to supply. And I think that they were pretty pleased with the outcome of all of that. A unified Germany in NATO, that for Washington was understood to be a big win. A Soviet Union that was no more, no need for containment, as you say. And then, of course, you have the first Gulf War. But I think there, too, there was a sense that the challenge had come about. U.S. had mustered a big international coalition. Soviet Union didn't object. Gorbachev didn't make a problem of himself. We were sort of living in a new world. And the Bush administration had got us there. So I think they didn't have time, to deal with the question of what's the strategy for the world still to come. I think that they felt like they were putting to rest this old Cold War world, sufficient as a task and as a challenge.
But there was triumphalism in there.
Definitely. a core misunderstanding in the United States, and it will reverberate really all the way down to the present moment, that we won the Cold War. And I think in a way, you can be charitable about it. You can say it was a reflection of how well the Bush team did in the end phase, and to a degree, the Reagan team as well. The sort of mixture of pressure and diplomacy and the sort of diplomatic skill of a George Bush Sr. is not to be underestimated. And I think it just felt sort of remarkably that everything had gone in a very rapid way in the direction the U.S. would have wanted it to go. And therefore, we, the United States, were the winner of the Cold War. But it's really a mistaken view of the end of the Cold War. It's much more a matter of Soviet collapse for reasons that were much more internal to the Soviet Union, particular to the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev, just particular to that moment. Yes, the U.S. sped certain things along, but frankly, the U.S. had no idea that the Soviet Union was going to collapse.
Exactly.
And containment was not a policy of destroying the Soviet Union. It was a policy of managing and dealing with the Soviet Union. So in a way, it sort of exceeded American strategic expectations in a way that really points up this truth of the period, that it's a moment of Soviet collapse. And the American triumphalism was not only analytically wrong, but it would cause quite a number of problems that are going to come after 1991.
When it did appear that the Soviet Union was really going to disappear, the Bush team got nervous about that. They at first did not want the Soviet Union to disappear. They were probably happy that communism was going bye-bye, but they didn't want the Union itself as a government state entity to disappear. Also, Odd Arnie Westat makes this point in his book, The Cold War, that in addition to the troubles inside the Soviet Union, there had been dramatic changes going on in the world dating to the 1970s and then on through the 1980s that also accelerated the end of this bipolarity.
The economic changes, for one, are crucial to the story of the Soviet Union's collapse. Just a new economy is born in the 1970s, and it's much less advantageous to the Soviet Union. That brings about a great crisis in the Soviet Union by the mid to late 1980s. And you can go back to Reagan and look at Star Wars and say, well, he put that crisis sort of to good use, and he sort of created a set of American advantages. And that may well be true, but it's useful to think of the crisis of the Soviet Union in the 1980s in this sense as a structural crisis, as just caused by technological and other kinds of change, and not a matter of American brilliance or realities that America was consciously creating. And I think that the other important dynamic of the 1980s, and it anticipates what we describe as the globalization of the 1990s, is the rise of new powers just as such. You're going to get the term a little bit later on, the BRICS, which comes from banking and management consulting, the sort of Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. But all of that is happening in the 80s, that there's a widening really of power outside of the Soviet Union and the United States that itself is sort of giving birth to a new world. So technology and vital developments that are happening outside of Moscow and outside of Washington are a story of the 1980s, and they're a story of the 1990s, and they got hidden a little bit. Again, the triumphalist worldview does just focus a lot on ourselves. Yes. And it focuses a lot on the Soviet Union, it focuses a lot on Russia, and that can be quite distorting in terms of other important things that were happening.
The silly idea that Ronald Reagan forced the Soviet Union into an arms race and it went bankrupt and kaput, and that's not true. So the 1990s, as I've been looking back at this decade, one of the main points I wanted to cover with you was whether this was a missed opportunity to reassess the purpose of American power, our role in the world, whether it really was a unipolar world. I mean, there's always multipolarity, right? For instance, rather than expand and enlarge NATO, allow European security to be handled by Europeans. Maybe there didn't need to be any more NATO because there was no more Warsaw Pact. But the first real decision point here, or one of the first real decision points here, was Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. This was an opportunity for the United States to, well, as the initial response inside the Bush administration was, thanks to the work of historian Jeffrey Engel, the initial response was, what does it matter if a barrel of oil has an Iraqi flag or a Kuwaiti flag? Whoever controls tiny Kuwait is going to want to sell the oil anyway. But that consideration gave way to a larger one, New World Order. This was less a question than a rambling monologue, Michael Kimmage, but what I'm getting at here is the United States didn't use this opportunity, if you will, to, say, pull back or let the world be as it is. Instead, it was an opportunity to create, well, a new world order or a system of rules, a way of reinforcing the liberal world order.
Right. Let's break your question. I would want to break your question into two pieces, really.
Please do, as many as you'd like.
The first piece is to acknowledge and to understand what was done well or what was done right after 1991. You know, it's an interesting counterfactual if 9/11 had not happened. If we would be speaking probably a bit more in the spirit of lavish praise when it comes to the 1990s, because I do think that in some areas of globalization, not across the board, but in some areas of globalization, it's very clear that what the U.S. enabled in the 1990s through its military power, through its emphasis on laws and multilateral institutions and structures in the 1990s, what the United States enabled, and there are other factors that matter too, but what the United States enabled was enormous prosperity on a global scale. That's what powers on the scale of the United States are able to offer, that you can trade and you can communicate and you can, sort of use the might of the U.S. Navy to create a certain degree of economic predictability in places. There's nothing to trifle with when it comes to the prosperity that comes in the 1990s, really, to the entire world. And that's to a degree a function of the liberal international order, or the kind of international order that both George Bush Sr. and Bill Clinton were trying to construct. And the second good aspect of U.S. policy in the 1990s was the sensitivity with which the U.S. approached, not across the board again, but a lot of what could be described as sort of small, or impolitely as weak countries. In Europe in particular, the U.S. does create and help to build an order in which Latvia has many of the same rights and privileges as Germany, France, or Britain. That's the European Union, that's the NATO alliance, the liberal international order, and that's the liberal international order at its best. And so part of the magnetism of the United States in the 1990s and in these years is that it really did have something to offer. It has something to offer these smaller countries who could buy into the system and get a degree of protection and decision-making power in the system, and then the prosperity that I mentioned at the beginning is very significant.
The passion for freedom cannot be denied forever. The world has waited long enough. The time is right. Let Europe be whole and free.
But there is, of course, as your question would suggest, another side to the story, and this would be my second larger point, that the U.S. was way too optimistic in the 1990s. We generally think of optimism as a good quality. It has its merits, but the U.S. was unbelievably optimistic. It was way too optimistic about Russia, that Russia wouldn't return to some of the concerns and ambitions that it's historically held. In Europe, it was way too optimistic about China, which has an alternate vision of international order to the U.S. It had it in the 1990s, and it very much has it today. It was too optimistic about the Middle East, even there, about things going in a certain direction. And on the basis of this optimism, the U.S. really overextended itself. And so its military is sort of omnipresent. And that's one thing if you're just sort of holding the peace and you're sort of garrisoning the global economy. If that's the job, I think the U.S. had the sort of the money and the means to do it. But if you have a violent world with clashing powers and the U.S. is sort of present everywhere and feels that it has to play a role, that's when you get to the overreach that is the dark side of the American foreign policy story in the 1990s. And that, of course, with September 11th, is going to go into very high gear. But the seeds of that overreach are certainly planted in the 1990s.
Absolutely, because it can be difficult to discern a pattern in U.S. foreign policy in the 90s because we intervened in some places but not others. So right. Rwanda is the one example everyone brings up when you talk about non-intervention. But Somalia, which was started under Bush and then Clinton pulled the troops out after Black Hawk Down.
This past weekend, we all reacted with anger and horror as an armed Somali gang desecrated the bodies of our American soldiers and displayed a captured American pilot. All of them soldiers who were taking part in an international effort to end the starvation of the Somali people themselves.
The Balkans twice. But the United States was also acting as a peacemaker, or trying to anyway, the Oslo Accords in 1993. I guess better way of putting my question, if we look at the 1990s as a start of a new era, without the Soviet Union around anymore and the Cold War is over, how would the U.S. define its interests and threats to those interests? Iraq's invasion of Kuwait is the first opportunity to do this.
And we stand today at a unique and extraordinary moment. The crisis in the Persian Gulf, as grave as it is, also offers a rare opportunity to move toward an historic period of cooperation. Out of these troubled times, our fifth objective, a new world order, can emerge, a new era
We're not going to let any tin pot dictator get away with invading a sovereign country, no matter how small or insignificant it might seem.
Right. I think if it had only been Iraq in that case, obviously the U.S. invasion leaves a lot of problems in its wake, but it also solves quite a few problems. The problem of Kuwaiti sovereignty, oil supply, certain concerns about Saudi security as a close partner in 1991 to the United States. And of course, every foreign affairs conflict is precedent setting. It was sort of, I think, useful at the time that Saddam Hussein wasn't able to set the precedent of a major cross-border invasion. So if it were only the Iraq war that we were debating, I think that the kind of Washington consensus of 1991 has a fair amount to recommend it. But it was a much more ambitious set of policies than that sort of were born in the 1990s. And what I find just bewildering, I don't even know if I'm critical, but I'm just bewildered by it, is how all kinds of ambitions begin to intersect and cross-fertilize each other in the 1990s. So on the one hand, there's the sort of economic globalization, and the U.S. needs to be the policeman. On the other hand, there's a whole network of sovereign countries and international order, and the U.S. needs to be the guarantor of that as well. But it didn't stop with those ambitions, which are big enough to begin with. It's the right to protect and humanitarian intervention really born in the Balkans, in former Yugoslavia, and that's, sort of Serbia, Kosovo, and Serbian conduct of some of the other powers there in the southeast of Europe. And there, the U.S. didn't really have clear economic interests, but it did feel like it was necessary to intervene on behalf of the Kosovar Albanians or the Kosovar population, in part.
Yeah, the ethnic Albanians in Kosovo.
The Clinton administration was very proud of that, and stopping atrocities is the right thing to do. There's no argument against that, but that as a vision for foreign policy, it's just unbelievably ambitious. And if you're going to do it in the southeast of Europe, then why don't you do it in Rwanda? And why don't you do it in Ethiopia? And why don't you do it in Colombia, in Latin America? And so you get not only this unbelievably huge ambition, but a lot of credible accusations of inconsistency or hypocrisy when it comes to the application of that ambition.
And the aftermath, though, of the Kosovo NATO really was a U.S. mission. The Kosovo Liberation Army has been accused of committing atrocities as well in the aftermath of that. So at the end of the decade, 1999, actually in a speech about the supposed success of the Kosovo intervention, President Clinton offers some remarks that seem to define what may have been the Clinton doctrine. Here they are.
It's easy, for example, to say that we really have no interest in who lives in this or that valley in Bosnia, or who owns a strip of brushland in the Horn of Africa, or some piece of parched earth by the Jordan River. But the true measure of our interests lies not in how small or distant these places are, or in whether we have trouble pronouncing their names. The question we must ask is, what are the consequences to our security of letting conflicts fester and spread? We cannot, indeed we should not, do everything or be everywhere. But where our values and our interests are at stake and where we can make a difference, we must be prepared to do so.
I mentioned Westad before. I'll return to him now, Michael Kimmage. He said that one version of post-Cold War triumphalism was the Clinton version, which emphasized U.S.-style capitalist prosperity and market values on a global scale. But he says its lack of specific purpose in international affairs was striking, as was its lack of discipline in achieving even its economic aims. Instead of building broad and stable frameworks for the conduct of U.S. foreign policy through the UN, international monetary institutions, and long-term agreements with other great powers, the Clinton administration concentrated on its prosperity agenda. Do you agree with that?
Implicit in those words of Bill Clinton's, and they're a little bit jargony, almost without meaning in some respects, but also just very general and very bland. I mean, implicit to that is that the U.S. doesn't have to choose. If you wanted to make the point very broadly, the refusal to choose then, and it was a very luxurious position that the U.S. occupies in the 1990s, given its military preeminence, enormous economic leverage, domestic political stability. I mean, it really did have every hallmark of a great power, and then some. But the problem with that luxurious position is that it can create the illusion that you don't have to choose. And so the habit of not choosing and the habit of not setting priorities really gets entrenched. And in some ways, it gets worse under George W. Bush because you have a huge crisis and he feels the urgent need to respond to it. And there's a failure to set priorities and to make choices within that response. And I think the Obama administration can be accused of a sort of similar reluctance or difficulty when it comes to making these choices or setting priorities. The tragedy of that, I suppose, if you look back over the course of the last 20, 25 years, is that if you don't make these choices and you don't create the habit of making choices, the choices get imposed upon you. And that happens, I think, really starting around 2011, second Obama term, where a lot of things really start to go wrong. You know, the relationship with Russia goes wrong, relationship with China goes wrong, Arab Spring sours in the U.S. itself. You have the financial crisis in the background of 2008. All these limits are starting to very rapidly be imposed on the United States, and as if it didn't have the, the muscle memory, the kind of mental discipline to make these choices and set priorities. And of course, Trump comes to power, and that's part of his spirit. We need to make choices. We need to minimize. We need to scale back. And some of what I think Trump said on the campaign trail rings true to me. But then as president, it doesn't seem to me like he implemented much or was able to come up with a real coherent foreign policy of his own. So to me, when I hear those Clinton words, it's not just the banality and the kind of smugness almost that bothers me. It's what he's giving to the next couple of administrations, that sort of lack of focus and lack of mental discipline. It's very disconcerting to hear in some ways in retrospect.
But even before Clinton, it's pretty clear to me, looking back on it, that George Bush's New World Order is never realized. The United States, again, wanted to be on top. It wanted to have a leading role in trying to shape the global environment through international institutions like the UN, right? So George Bush does go to the UN to try to punish Saddam Hussein and set an example, right? For all future aggressors, this is how the world is going to deal with you.
An era in which the nations of the world, East and West, North and South, can prosper and live in harmony. 100 generations have searched for this elusive path to peace, while 1,000 wars raged across the span of human endeavor. And today, that new world is struggling to be born.
But that vision is never realized, and a big reason why is because Russia never really joins the international concerts. And there's a lot of debate as to who's to blame for that. Was it the West or was it Russia? I mean, I would say primarily Russia. But would you agree that Bush's New World Order never comes into being? And not because he was naive and thought it would be easy. It's just the world continued to be a really messy place.
Yes. I think that maybe a typical mistake of the time, and perhaps we make it at times as well in the present moment, but a typical mistake of the time to confuse certain parts of Asia and certain parts of Europe with the world.
Yeah, what do we mean by world order? Europe and the United States?
Right. There's that problem. And I think that traditionally American policymakers, by virtue of their education and by virtue of where some of the biggest crises are in the world, have tended to focus foremost on Europe and then China and Japan in Asia. And so if you limit your focus in the early 1990s and you sort of say, how do things look in the vicinity of Japan and how do things look in the vicinity of Germany, right? Those are the two focal points, for understandable reasons, of American foreign policy since 1945. Things look pretty good. You have a network of U.S. partnerships in Asia. You have growing prosperity, rising volume of trade and commerce. And the same is true in post-Cold War Europe. And so, yes, if you can narrow your focus to that degree, there are great strides being made toward a new world order in the early 1990s. And they do have a lot to do with the fall of the Soviet Union and a lot to do with a lot of what the United States had to offer. On the other hand, if you take, as you're asking me to do, if you take a kind of more rigorous view and in a way a more global view, there are huge holes in the world order from the very beginning. As we touched on earlier, China doesn't cease being communist in 1991. It's maybe less revolutionary, it's more capitalist than it was, but it's still a very different political culture from the United States. And there's a lot that it doesn't like about the U.S. and there's a lot that it resents about the West for historical reasons. So there's that as a kind of hole within the world order of Bush's imagination. But yes, Russia is a huge problem because it only signs on to the parts of the world order, so typical for a lot of countries, only signs on to the part of the world order that it likes. And that part for Russia in the 90s is the economic part. It wants to gain access to foreign markets, it wants to sell its arms and its oil, and it wants to import eventually iPhones and personal computers and these things, or fashion or, food it wants to import into Russia. But it does not want to sign on to the parts of the world order that demand, international law, that demand political reform, and that demand, sort of American style behavior or American style ideals. And so how much of a world order is it if China and Russia are not a part of it? You've got a tripod without two of it.
The idea was Russia would become part of the new security order. And Jim Goldgeier wrote an excellent column for War on the Rocks about promises made, promises broken. This whole debate as to what the United States told Russia and Yeltsin about NATO enlargement and its place in the European concert, if you will. And he really focuses on a meeting in October of 1993 when U.S. officials, namely Warren Christopher, Strobe Talbot, tell Yeltsin that the U.S. is going to pause NATO enlargement, or at least not step on the gas, right? And instead do something called the Partnership for Peace, which Russia joins. But then the following year, we backtrack on that supposed promise, and we want to go NATO enlargement full throttle, and Yeltsin was apoplectic, but was too weak to stop it. In other words, the ruin of U.S. Russia relations. The decade ends with Vladimir Putin in power. That story was not inevitable. How much import do you place in this early 90s, 1993 meeting?
I have a different reading from, of course, Jim Goldgeier is a wonderful, wonderful scholar. There's a lot to learn from what he's saying in that piece and from your paraphrase of it, but I take a different view of the whole problem of NATO and NATO expansion. I mean, I think looking back, it would have been better to be slower about NATO expansion and to be more creative and to recognize that, Central and Eastern Europe is a war zone and a zone of imperial contestation and competition for hundreds of years. And to me, the mistake of the architects of NATO expansion, it wasn't so much NATO expansion, but it was the forgetting of that fact. This is just so highly contested. So it was deeply naive to imagine that NATO could sort of expand and that everything would be easy going forward, or that the expansion of NATO itself was somehow the answer to the region's problems, which it certainly isn't. But I don't see the 1990s as maybe so catastrophic or so tragic. Putin comes to power. He speculates about Russia joining NATO in 2002. There's actually a memo put forward in the U.S. Office of Policy Planning in around 2002 about having Russia join NATO. Obviously, that wasn't in the cards, and it wasn't, I think, that serious on either side, but that was at least discussable.
The idea that Russia would be part of a new security order was always there.
Right. That idea was in the background, and even a part of NATO. It was sort of conceivable in the first couple of years that Putin was president. And when NATO expands into the Baltic republics, which is pretty sensitive for Russia geographically, Narva in the eastern part of Estonia, I think it's about 150 or 200 kilometers from St. Petersburg. But even then, it's not a total catastrophe. I mean, you have a pretty good working relationship between George W. Bush and Vladimir Putin. In 2007, W. Bush hosts Putin in the family compound, the Bush family compound in Kennebunkport. There are still state visits.
First, I'd like to congratulate President Putin for being the only person that caught a fish today.
We've got one fish, but that was a team effort, and the merit goes to the captain of the
Very thoughtful of you. Do I trust him? Yeah, I trust him. Do I like everything he says? No. And I suspect he doesn't like everything I say.
I don't see that the relationship is predestined for a disaster at that point. I mean, I do think NATO's big mistake, really more on behalf of Ukraine than on behalf of NATO, but its big mistake was to promise NATO membership for Georgia and Ukraine at the Bucharest summit in 2008.
Here in Bucharest, we must make clear that NATO welcomes the aspirations of Georgia and Ukraine for their membership in NATO.
And then to incite these hopes in Ukraine about NATO membership, to incite fears in Russia about NATO membership, without really being very sincere about the offer to begin with. That, to me, seems like a huge mistake and one that sort of leads us down the road to where we are now. But that's actually not NATO expansion. That's a kind of lack of discipline regarding NATO messaging in an area that is of real sensitivity and strategic concern to Russia. So I think until we get to 2008, the story is not so dark. But even then, sort of 2013, 2014 in Ukraine could probably have been navigated differently or better, and maybe we could have avoided some of the strife that's come upon us. But to me, that's maybe not so precisely a NATO issue. It's maybe more bilateral U.S. Russian or European Russian. But clearly there are a lot of things that are very much going wrong by 2014. And probably the catastrophe that we're living through now is to a degree predestined. And
so what you're saying is the fate of U.S.-Russia relations was not sealed in the 1990s alone, that it was still in play. So the Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, they joined NATO in 1999, and then in 2004 you get a big expansion. Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia. Those three Baltic states had been part of the Soviet Union but never internationally recognized. They were annexed illegally by Stalin in World War II. So a lot of other things, to your point, a lot of other things are happening during this time. We have two wars in Chechnya, which contribute to the worsening of U.S. Russia relations. We have decisions being made inside Russia. Yeltsin turns the tanks on the Russian parliament, which is known as the White House there, and spills blood in order to stay in power. Clinton administration felt like the alternatives to Yeltsin would be far worse, so they stick with him through all these times. The invasion of Iraq in 2003 was opposed by Vladimir Putin, and then George Bush waved his finger at Putin in 2008 when he was waging war in Georgia. A lot happening there. It wasn't just a matter of NATO expansion. That was just one of many factors.
For sure. I think that we can come full circle in our conversation, Martin, in a way, in terms of trying to understand the issue of NATO expansion and what may have been wrong with it or where the problem is. And to me, again, it's a little bit less what it provokes in Russia. That's an important story to try to understand. You know, Putin exaggerates that at times and uses that narrative for his purposes, which is important to acknowledge as well. But I think it's more these assumptions that in the 1990s. You know, the point from earlier in our conversation, the assumption that the world is becoming more democratic, the assumption that the world is becoming more integrated and globalized, and the assumption that because of these first 2 points, peace is going to be more entrenched in our world than it was in the world of the 1920s or 1930s or 1940s and 50s when the Cold War was kicking into high gear. Those assumptions turned out to be wrong. If those assumptions had been right, NATO expansion would have been fine. The NATO expansion would have been just yet another step toward greater democracy in Europe, greater democracy in Russia, greater economic integration. And if you have an integrating democratic Russia and Europe that are basically at peace with one another, maybe NATO would turn out to be a kind of formality. Well, it's there in Europe, but overall the relations between everyone or among everyone are so good that NATO is not really relevant. Maybe that would have been the greatest achievement of all for NATO. It could have achieved its own irrelevance, and what better function for a defensive military alliance than that? Yeah. But the problem is that those assumptions were wrong. Russia was not becoming more democratic. Certainly with Putin, it wasn't. Yes, economic integration was a reality, and Russia did integrate a lot economically with Europe, a little bit less so with the U.S., but the conditions for peace were not there at all. The revanchist ambitions in Russia that if you look below the surface, you'll see are kind of there with Yeltsin. They're kind of there with Gorbachev, and they're very much there with Putin. So that assumption was really way off the mark. And unfortunately, that put NATO into territory, into a region of Europe that's very contested, very dangerous. And you've got some countries that are in and some countries that are not. So what's the logic of it? Latvia is in and Poland is in, but Belarus is not. What can explain that? What's the rationale? And that's, I think, the problem that NATO creates itself. It's more than whatever it stimulated in Russia, which is ultimately Russia's business. It created a problem of being present in a region that's dangerous without having the equipment or tools to deal with a lot of those dangers.
Yeah, the internal failure in Russia of democratic capitalism is a huge part of this story, but a lot of those economic reforms were pushed on Russia by the United States, and they did not work. They were disastrous. I forgot to mention another factor in the worsening of this relationship. Russia objecting to the U.S. intervention in Kosovo in 1999 really poisoned the relationship as well, as often overlooked today when we only focus on NATO expansion. So maybe another assumption was, and President Obama used this word in 2014 when he called Russia a regional power. The idea that Russia would not become or not remain a major player, if not a superpower anymore. But, the Soviet Union was gone, but this massive country was still there. And after it went through this rough patch, it was going to come back wishing that it was like it used to be. Not the Soviet Union, but still a very powerful country.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think that, in a way, that's not the problem of the 1990s. I think Bill Clinton, when it came to Russia, he invested a lot. It was what was called the Bill and Boris show.
Так вот, не первый раз я вам говорю, что вы провалились.
Well, now for the first time I can tell you that you're a disaster.
Personal prestige was on the line for him there. He did.
Absolutely. And I think that he was, of course, a president who came of age with the Cold War. He did put Russia in many ways front and center. And the U.S. gives quite a lot of economic aid to Russia, in addition to, the idea of shock therapy, which was as bad as you've described it. But, there was a real effort with a certain amount of American arrogance and hubris about its institutions and NATO and all of that. That's part of the picture, too. But it's not that Russia was deprioritized in the 1990s. I think Clinton really understood how important the country is or how important the country can be. I think George W. Bush is taking things already in quite a different direction. I just recently read his memoirs, and I looked at some of the passages on, say, like the Georgia War, NATO expansion. It's like 2 or 3 sentences in the memoir. Everything else is, and it's understandable, of course. It's 9/11, it's the Iraq War, it's Afghanistan, it's terrorism. I think those issues just took precedent enormously, and Russia was looked upon as it's not a big problem. In the war on terror, Russia can offer a few assets, as it in fact did. And, there's not a big issue. There's not a huge thing to worry about, either vis-a-vis Russia in Europe or just vis-a-vis Russia as such. And for Obama, I think it's a little bit different. There's a kind of condescension toward Russia because it's not an economic heavyweight. Obama's view of the international landscape is colored quite a bit by economic power. That's why he thinks that Asia is more important in some respects than Europe, because it's, sort of evolving into the economic center of gravity for the world. And so the pivot to Asia is sort of about that. China matters also because of its economic weight for the Obama administration. And Russia is just not a country that's innovating. It's not growing. Yeah. It's not really going anywhere economically. It's all fossil fuels and, sort of nuclear weapons. So it's not quite John McCain, who would call Russia a Pravolta with nukes. It's not that level of condescension, but you can feel it in Obama, and it was a misread.
Yeah, the nukes matter. The nukes matter.
Well, the nukes matter. And Russia is, whether we like it or not, it's an integral part of the European state system. It's an integral part of Europe. And so whether it's a good part or a bad part, problematic, not problematic, it just matters enormously. And as we've learned, Russia matters quite a bit in Africa now. It's a pretty important power in the Middle East. Its relationship with China is highly significant. And even, in Venezuela and other parts of South America, Latin America, Russia's a factor too. So yeah, it's just it's a foolish frame for Russia to say that it's on the way out or middling or not that important. It just happens to be one of the handful of countries that's at the center of the international story one way or another. And it's been that way for the last, sort of 150, 200 years.
So if a Cold War worldview or a way of looking at the world as a set of blocks started to give way to the view that it was a messier world, a multipolar world, and there were people concerned about a return to bloc politics, i.e., where would the new dividing line in Europe fall, right? Every time NATO moved a little bit further to the east, well, then you have a new border, right? How much thought was given during this period to non-state actors, i.e., the people who turned the world upside down on September 11th, 2001?
The United States launched an attack this morning on one of the most active terrorist bases in the world. It is located in Afghanistan and operated by groups affiliated with Osama bin Laden, a network not sponsored by any state, but as dangerous as any we face.
Well, there are a couple of things that are not given a great deal of attention in the 1990s, and they all happen to converge on September 11th. And certainly one, as you're suggesting, Martin, is non-state actors. I mean, there's a very rosy view of non-state actors in the 1990s, that these are sort of NGOs and groups that might deal with pandemics or with climate change, which was sort of a blip on the horizon in the 1990s, but was becoming an issue, or this would be important for the Clinton administration, sort of many issues that involve human rights, that you would have cross-border international coalitions that would deal with them. I think that was the framework for understanding non-governmental entities. But another thing that's not given a lot of attention in the 1990s is religion. I mean, you have the fatwa against Salman Rushdie, which captures everybody's attention. I think that was 1990 or 1989. That was a big issue. But religion, I think, was not seen to be all that important to foreign policy. It was sort of a thing of the past. The Soviet Union had an ideology. It was gone. The age of ideologies is over. The age of big ideas is sort of over. A lot of what the world is about, again, is economics. Those two things happened to collide on September 11th. A kind of religious fanaticism, I think, that took most Americans by surprise, associated maybe with Iran and, corners of the government in Pakistan and elsewhere, but not as a huge factor in the world. And then that you could have, and I think that was the surprise of al-Qaeda in 9/11, that really al-Qaeda was a very globalized operation. They used, the internet, they used cell phones, they used modern technology to be this kind of cross-border global entity. They sent their, figures to flight school in the U.S. and
where they were geographically wasn't as important as it may
exactly.
have been, yes.
No, exactly. So it was a new face of globalization that emerged suddenly and frighteningly on September 11th. And I think that we just were completely unready for it. In some ways, to touch on themes elsewhere in our conversation, it's almost the continuity from the Cold War period that was the problem pre-September 11th, because we were still very much accustomed to think of, well, it's nuclear weapons and it's the great powers, it's the Chinas of the world and the Russias. These are the big factors. And how can a couple of guys in Afghanistan, 20 guys in Afghanistan, how could they upend life in the United States? And to be honest, it was a good question then, but it was not even a question that was asked. It was a hard issue to anticipate.
Then George W. Bush shoehorns the problem of al-Qaeda and international Islamism into the state model, if you will. These terrorist groups are not just operating on their own. They are being sponsored by and receiving physical harbor from states. So what do? Instead of dealing with terrorism like a police problem, a detective problem, an intelligence problem, we invade with conventional arms, conventional armies, 2 countries in the greater Middle East. The unintended consequences of poorly thought out ideas. We'll be talking about this forever.
This is only an anecdotal answer to your question, Martin, but I do recall a British policeman who was interviewed right after September 11th in the American press. And he said, we've been dealing with terrorism in the UK for the last, couple of decades related to tensions between England and Ireland. Terrorism is ultimately a policing issue. I remember the response, I think it may even have been my own response, was to sort of scoff at that. I mean, come on, you can't deal with September 11th, which just felt like it was an attack on everything we are and represent and our daily life and ability to function as Americans. You can't respond to that with just a bit of policing action. You need something bigger than that. You need something that's going to either send a message or really shake things up. And I think that was definitely Dick Cheney's understanding. There is, I think, a very important personnel continuity between the Cold War period. Dick Cheney is created by the Cold War in terms of his outlook on the world and understanding of American power. And I think that he also feels, and I think Rumsfeld is similar, I think those are the 2 biggest movers of the policy, that you need a proportional response to 9/11. Therefore, it has to be a kind of state-on-state war, which is what the U.S. military had been designed to fight prior to September 11th. So there was an inability, in a way, to say that policing might be the right answer. And it was too difficult for the U.S. to change gears on a dime on September 11th and to think of, and I think these techniques have come to the fore more recently, but sort of much more localized ways of fighting terrorism. And maybe even a certain acknowledgement, which is probably that when it comes to something like terrorism, you're never going to win 100%.
No, it's a tactic.
You're right. You'll never eradicate the will or the appetite that in some ways what terrorists are trying to do is to provoke you into overreaction. I think Osama bin Laden had that idea in mind.
Absolutely.
And so you want to think twice before you engage in massive responses and really think through whether you might be overreacting and in that sense sort of playing into the hands of terrorists. And I think that we've gotten there to a degree since 9/11. I think we've sort of worked our way through over the last 20 years to maybe what the right response is to terrorism as a global problem. But boy, were we unprepared for that on the day itself.
On September the 11th, enemies of freedom committed an act of war against our country. Americans have known wars, but for the past 136 years, they have been wars on foreign soil, except for one Sunday in 1941. Americans have known the casualties of war, but not at the center of a great city on a peaceful morning. Americans have known surprise attacks, but never before on thousands of civilians. All of this was brought upon us in a single day, and night fell on a different world, a world where freedom itself is under attack.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, in Mississippi, they've declared Confederate Heritage Month. What the hell is that? That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.